Tom Harwood, welcome to the show. Do you think Rishi is a little ahead of himself in talking about balancing the books at this time of national economic crisis?
Not at all. I think that in the Conservative Party, and let's remember this was a speech to the Conservative Party conference, there are lots of people who are deeply, deeply worried about what is seen as profligate spending, about this unprecedented engorgement of the national debt. Now, this is something that is deeply concerning to a lot of people that he was speaking to, not quite in that hall with him, but virtually watching at home today. And so it was important, I think, for him to remind them that this is not going to go on forever, that there will come a time where we have to sort of take a step back and realize that there is no such thing as a magic money tree, that we can't go on printing our way out of a crisis, pretending that we can borrow our way out of debt. That's simply not going to happen. And so it was right, I think, that he reminded everyone today that there will come a time where we have to pay for this all. That's just a simple fact. And it won't be immediately. Of course, it won't be immediately. It looks like we're approaching a second wave, and there is more support, such as what the Chancellor set out just a couple of weeks ago now, with the new scheme pumping yet more billions into supporting jobs in this country. But there will come a time where we do have to pay for this, and I think that's quite right that he acknowledged that.
Tom, our text poll question of the day has been as follows: would Rishi Sunak be a better Prime Minister? And he's currently in the lead. There is widespread disappointment from a lot of Boris's supporters about his performance in recent months. Clearly, he suffered a shocking health trauma when he contracted COVID-19 himself. He was in intensive care, and we're all collectively pleased that he recovered. Are you concerned about his performance at the moment? The biggest headache he's got is that there is a guy next door who could happily become Prime Minister and looks oven ready as we speak.
Well, he's got a very difficult balancing act, does Boris, because of course there's on the one hand the economic concern that's expressed through people like Rishi Sunak and the sort of hawks within the cabinet who are really putting pressure in terms of getting the economy moving as quickly as possible. But on the other hand, he's got his medical advisors and people in charge of the sort of science of things, you know, the Chris Whitties, the Patrick Valences, the Matt Hancocks, who we hear constantly are sort of on the brink of resigning if there aren't enough measures put forward. So of course the Prime Minister has to sort of be in this balancing act, and to some extent what we've seen over the last few weeks and months is a sort of good cop bad cop routine where Rishi sort of hands out the sweets and Boris has to sort of say, well, if you don't behave, we're going to slap you with a fine. Now of course that's going to have consequences for popularity, but I would say this stuff does go up and down, and there will come a time where there is more immediate economic hardship, where the recession that we have suffered starts to be felt by people in their pockets, and perhaps the Chancellor won't be such a golden boy then, as is inevitable with all of these jobs. Tricky decisions have to be made. Popularity goes up and down.
It's interesting, isn't it, James, that there is increasing lockdown fatigue across the country, and it might not just be fatigue, it might be anger, given the fact that people are seeing the economic impact of a lot of lockdown measures whilst numbers continue to rise. I mean, some of the cities and regions where lockdown measures are strictest are seeing the highest rates in the spread of the disease. Do you think there's an opportunity for Labour to begin to question some of these local lockdowns?
I think that's already been raised. Certainly, you know, people like Andy Burnham in Manchester and some of the other Labour mayors have already raised the issue of lockdowns being imposed, but then a lack of powers and certainly a lack of adequate testing and tracing facilities being made available on a local level to actually be able to contain and trace and put the virus in its place. So I think that's already starting to happen. And I think, you know, you raise a point about lockdown fatigue. It's you know, broadly speaking, if we have to do another national lockdown, and let's hope we don't, but in an emergency, this is what ends up happening. I think people will grit their teeth and support that because they'll see the problem that we're up against. But there is the longer term issue of how do we adapt to a world where the virus isn't going away anytime soon, and that I think is where we need to get to. And that does mean, by the way, having things like testing and tracing up and running. It does mean things like making jobs safe and secure, and that we can continue some form of you know, relatively normal existence, or at least until there's a vaccine available. And that, I think, is where we need to get to. Rishi Sunak has raised this himself, of course. His speech last week, he was talking about permanent changes to the economy. Now, we might start to see some of what he thinks that means. And when he talks about viable and non-viable jobs, it may not be very pleasant for a whole number of people. And that I suspect, is where politics is going to end up in the future.
Indeed. Your reaction to Public Health England having mislaid 16,000 positive test results for COVID-19.
Well, it's unbelievable. Well, no, unfortunately, it's all too believable. I mean, look, mistakes happen. In this case, it looks like a spreadsheet error by some unfortunate official somewhere. But the problem here is that there was not the checks in place to prevent that happening. The thing just slipped out into the wild and became the official figures last week. So that's kind of another thing that's gone wrong, and a succession of things that have gone wrong over the last 9 months. I mean, the government has not handled this crisis at all well. That is why we have so many COVID cases and, of course, tragically, so many deaths. You can look at other places where they've dealt with, yes, an unprecedented crisis, but dealt with it better than the government here has done. And really, it's just another sort of failure in a long line of failures stretching all the way back, really, to February.
Tom, obviously, the issue with the COVID cases that didn't get logged, 16,000, which is an astonishingly large number, it all perpetuates the narrative of a government not in control, a government that's lost control of this pandemic, which is directly paraphrasing comments from Keir Starmer a few days ago. The gloves are off now from the opposition. Is this a problem for the government?
Well, I think it would be if the opposition was actually saying anything different. But I think the sad fact of the matter now in the House of Commons is that the opposition isn't providing any opposition whatsoever to the meat of the measures that are being implemented by the government. We had the famous Brady Amendment almost come before the House last week, and actually Labour wouldn't say whether they support it or not. In fact, the opposition being provided in the House of Commons today comes from the backbenches of the Conservative Party, not the Labour Party, not the Lib Dems, not the SNP. It's people like Graham Brady and Steve Baker who are sort of saying, hang on, how about there's some more scrutiny over the removal of our liberties? And so it's quite odd that the Labour Party would be seeking to make political capital out of things that they support. I haven't heard a single thing from Keir Starmer that would be done completely differently, other than, oh, we would manage this a little bit more competently. I don't know how the Labour Party would manage an IT project more competently. Famously, over decades, these things are mishandled by governments. This is the problem. We're facing a collective action problem in this country where the government does need to step in, but traditionally governments are very bad at this sort of administration, at doing large IT projects, at all of this sort of stuff. So you've got these two immovable objects that are trying to meet each other. But I do think it is a bit sad that the Labour Party are trying to sort of make all this hay and not offering a different path, not saying anything substantively different, backing every single measure that the government does. Where is the opposition to the clearly counterproductive curfew? I would love to see Sir Keir Starmer stand on his feet and say, hang on, this is going too far, take a step back, reassess, perhaps we need to repeal this. But the Labour Party can't bring themselves to say that. They're not offering any opposition, and it's kind of sad.
Interesting to hear both sides, as always. Tom Harwood is a writer at Guido Fawkes, and James Meadway, former advisor to John McDonnell. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. I'm going